What if the samurai's ultimate secret to invincibility was also the blueprint for their own demise? How did a code of honor, meticulously crafted over centuries to forge perfect warriors, transform in a single instant into their death warrant? Conventional wisdom suggests they were undone by modernity, gunpowder, cannons, and political reforms. But that's merely a convenient veneer for a far more terrifying and irrational truth. This isn't a mere tale of military reform. This is an intellectual thriller about how a philosophy can turn lethal to its very architects. I invite you not merely to discover the history of the last samurai. I propose we collaboratively crack the code of Bushido, a philosophical virus that compelled history's most disciplined warriors to choose not life, but an impeccably beautiful end. Let's transport ourselves to Japan in the mid-19th century. To truly grasp it, one must first feel it. The air here is thick and multi-layered. It's a heady blend of the ancient scent of damp earth, wet wood, and blooming cherry blossoms, now mingling with the new, acrid tang of coal smoke from the steamships the foreigners called black ships. Down Edo's narrow lanes, the aroma of grilled fish and soy sauce from 1,000 eateries clashes with the sharp, chemical reek of gun oil emanating from arsenals, churning out copies of Western weaponry. The soundscape, too, is fraying at the seams. The familiar clatter of wooden gaiter sandals on stone pavements is drowned out by the heavy, measured tread of soldiers shod in European boots. The meditative chime of temple bells is punctuated by the thunderous roar of cannon fire from training grounds. This is a world where centuries of silence crumble under the onslaught of industrial din. This world wasn't an empty vessel. It was permeated by invisible force fields, by cultural codes that, to a Japanese person of that era, were more real than the very stones beneath their feet. The first and foremost of these codes was giri. This word is often translated as duty or obligation, but those renditions fall infinitely short. Giri was an all-consuming cosmic force of mutual obligation. It was your debt to your daimyo, your feudal lord, who bestowed upon you land and status. It was your debt to your clan, to your family, to the ancestors whose names you bore. It was a debt even to your own sword. To violate giri wasn't merely to commit a transgression. It meant plummeting out of the universe, becoming a cosmic orphan, erasing oneself from the very fabric of existence. Death was an incomparably lesser evil than a life lived with giri unfulfilled. The second code was tangible, the sword itself, the katana. To a European, a sword was a weapon. To a samurai, it was his soul, forged in steel. It was the visible embodiment of his honor, his status, and his lineage. Generations of master craftsmen poured not just technology, but also spirit into the blade. A samurai conversed with his sword, tending to it as if it were a living entity. The sword was his identity card, his passport in the realm of honor. To be stripped of one's sword wasn't merely to be disarmed. It was tantamount to having one's name, face, and right to exist ripped away from a living person. Thus, when the new government eventually issued an edict forbidding the wearing of swords, it was perceived not as an administrative measure, but as an order for collective spiritual suicide. And here we arrive at a pivotal analogy that will help us grasp the full picture. The samurai class, living by the code of Bushido, was not merely a warrior caste. It was an elite operating on the most sophisticated yet hopelessly obsolete operating system. This system, honed over 7 centuries, was perfectly designed to address the challenges of the feudal world. It flawlessly processed concepts such as loyalty to one's lord, honor in battle, and a dignified death. Every one of its protocols was geared toward maintaining a rigid hierarchy and internal stability. There were no bugs in this system. It was a veritable work of art. But when Commodore Perry's black ships steamed into Edo Bay, they didn't just bring cannons. They brought an entirely new operating system for the world. industrial capitalism, mass conscript armies, global politics, and gunboat diplomacy. The old Bushido Code proved not merely inefficient, it was fatally incompatible with this new reality. The system confronted challenges for which it had not a single command. Any attempt to run new applications on the old operating system led to a critical error. What do you do when your lord commands you to lay down your sword and don a European uniform? How do you demonstrate loyalty when the very state you serve is dismantling your status? How do you preserve honor when your martial skills are rendered obsolete by a long-range rifle in the hands of a former peasant? The Bushido operating system, unable to adapt or update, began executing the only remaining protocol it knew to perfection, the protocol of an impeccable and glorious end. The watershed moment, the very catalyst that shattered centuries of tradition, occurred on one specific day, July 8th, 1853. 4 American warships, under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry, sailed into Edo Bay. For the Japanese, who had lived in nearly complete isolation for 250 years, this was akin to an alien visitation. These ships weren't just large, they were monstrously enormous, black, and unlike elegant Japanese junks, they moved against the wind and current, spewing thick, foul smoke from their funnels. This wasn't just a fleet. It was a raw demonstration of power that rendered all samurai valor, all the artistry of swordsmanship, meaningless. Perry's cannons could incinerate the capital without even entering the range of Japanese shore batteries. This moment became a profound national humiliation. The shogunate, the military government that ruled the country on behalf of the emperor, found itself powerless. Under the threat of direct military invasion, Japan was forced to sign what became known as the unequal treaties. These opened ports to foreign trade, granted foreigners extraterritorial rights, meaning they were not subject to Japanese law, and stripped the country of its tariff autonomy. For the samurai class, whose primary function and justification for existence was the defense of the nation against barbarians, this was a catastrophe. Their code, their training, their entire way of life proved useless in the face of industrial might. The nation's honor had been trampled, and they were held responsible. It was in this crucible of humiliation and fear that 2 opposing philosophies emerged, 2 paths to salvation that fractured the samurai elite. The first path was one of radical pragmatism. Its proponents, the future architects of a new Japan, figures like Ōkubo Toshimichi and Ito Hirobumi, reasoned with stark, unsentimental logic. To defeat the barbarians, we must become barbarians. We must cast aside everything that makes us weak, our isolation, our feudal structure, and yes, even our samurai privileges. We will copy their technology, their army, their system of governance, and one day we will use it against them. This was a path of painful but necessary surgical intervention. But there was also a second path, the path of purification. Its adherents believed the problem wasn't with the code itself, but that the samurai had betrayed it. They had grown soft, mired in bureaucracy and luxury. Japan had weakened because its spirit had been poisoned. The solution: return to the roots. Expel the barbarians, overthrow the corrupt shogunate, restore true power to the divine emperor, and revive the genuine, uncompromising spirit of Bushido. And the standard bearer of this movement, its living embodiment, was a man whose name is still spoken in Japan with reverence: Saigō Takamori. Saigō was not merely a military commander, he was a colossus, both physically and morally. A giant, nearly 6.5-foot tall man with a powerful build and a head compared to that of a lion. He possessed incredible charisma, was utterly indifferent to money and power, and his personal integrity was legendary. He was the living ideal of a samurai from ancient tales, transported into the 19th century, and therein lay both his strength and his tragedy. He was one of the central figures of the Meiji Restoration, the overthrow of the shogun, and the restoration of imperial rule. He helped establish the new government, genuinely believing it would reclaim Japan's lost honor and spirit. But when this new government, composed of his erstwhile comrades, began implementing pro-Western reforms, Saigō found himself in an agonizing predicament. He watched as his companions shaved their samurai top-knots, donned European suits, and spoke of banks, railways, and universal conscription. For them, this was progress. For him, it was a betrayal of everything they had fought for. He couldn't accept a world where loyalty was measured not by devotion to one's lord, but by stock prices, and valor by the ability to fire a rifle, not the artistry of swordsmanship. His resignation from government posts and return to his home province of Satsuma caused an explosion. This was not merely the retirement of a politician, it was a moral condemnation of the entire new direction. Thousands of samurai across the country, stripped of their lands, stipends, and most importantly, their status and purpose in life, saw in Saigō their sole protector. He didn't call for rebellion, but his very existence, his silent dissent against the unfolding changes, transformed Satsuma into a magnet for all who felt insulted and humiliated. He became a driver of history, even against his will. He was the last samurai, and the system he had helped create now viewed him as the principal threat to its future. A clash became inevitable. To understand why the samurai were so deadly and why their end was so predetermined, we need to look under the hood of their core system, the Bushido Code. The best metaphor for it isn't a mere set of rules, but a perfectly calibrated clockwork mechanism. Every element, every cog within it, was fitted with absolute precision, and the entire mechanism was wound for one singular purpose: the creation of a warrior for whom death in battle was not just a possible outcome, but the highest form of self-actualization. It was a mechanism for producing predictable and controllable valor. Let's break it down into its constituent parts. Step 1. The total devaluation of one's own life. From childhood, a samurai was indoctrinated to believe that his body, his feelings, his very self did not belong to him. They belonged to his lord, his clan, his duty. Boys were made to walk barefoot in the snow during winter, to spend nights in cemeteries, to witness executions, all to accustom them to the sight of blood and suffering. The goal was simple: to eradicate the fundamental animal fear of death from their consciousness. Death was transformed from a tragedy into a working tool, an option that could and should be chosen if honor and duty demanded it. Life was merely a temporary state, and death, a passage to eternal glory. Step 2. The cult of the sword as an extension of the soul. Training in swordsmanship, kenjutsu, was not merely physical exercise. It was a spiritual practice, Zen in motion. Years were spent perfecting a single, ideal strike. A warrior was expected to achieve the state of mushin, or no mind, where the body moved instinctively, without conscious thought. The sword and the hand became one, and the strike a pure expression of spirit. This transformed a duel from a simple exchange of blows into a philosophical dialogue, where steel blades were the arguments and death the final word. This is precisely why the edict prohibiting swords was such a shock. It didn't just take away a weapon, it severed the samurai from the main source of their spiritual power. Step 3. The ritualization of death through seppuku. This was arguably the most alien concept to a Western mind and the most crucial element of the entire system. Seppuku, also known as harakiri, was not merely suicide. It was a privilege, the ultimate act of will, accessible only to a samurai. Through this ritual, a samurai could wash away any disgrace, prove their innocence, express protest, or follow their lord into the afterlife. It was the final and most potent way to affirm one's honor. What mattered was not death itself, but the flawless execution of the ritual, the coolness of mind, the precision of the cut, the dignity in the face of excruciating pain. Having this ultimate recourse rendered the samurai utterly fearless. Even in the most dire straits, he always had a way to emerge victorious, through a perfect death. And now, Let's visualize this mechanism in action. Picture a battlefield. On one side, an army of peasants. For them, death meant the absolute end. They might possess courage, but deep down, their instincts screamed for survival. On the other, a unit of samurai. To them, this field wasn't a place of terror, but a grand stage upon which they would fulfill their destiny. Their movements, honed over years of rigorous training, were automatic, almost a second nature. They harbored no fear of death. In fact, they actively sought a death befitting their honor. They didn't deliberate, they acted. This psychological edge was more terrifying than any weapon forged. A samurai charging into battle was more than a mere soldier. He was a living work of art, a perfectly calibrated mechanism of destruction, ready at any moment to conclude his mission with unwavering honor. Yet, this very same mechanism, flawlessly tuned for medieval warfare, proved utterly helpless against the onslaught of industrial war. A bullet, fired from a rifle hundreds of yards away by a terrified recruit, killed a master swordsman just as efficiently as it would anyone else. An artillery shell made no distinction between coward and hero. The entire intricate system of spiritual conditioning, the revered cult of personal valor, all became devalued overnight. The delicate clockwork of Bushido collided with the steam hammer of a new era, and its finest gears began to shatter one after another. The system couldn't adapt. It could only play out its predetermined program to its logical, tragic conclusion. We speak of grand ideas and lofty codes, but history is ultimately forged by ordinary people. Let's explore this pivotal era through the lived experience of an everyday, low-ranking samurai from Satsuma province. Only yesterday, his life's path was meticulously charted for generations to come. He served his daimyo, received a modest but stable stipend of rice, trained diligently with sword and spear, and his sole purpose in life was to fulfill his duty with honor. He walked past peasants and merchants with his head held high, for he belonged to the noble class, a privileged stratum representing merely 6% of the nation's population, yet wielding absolute power. His world was simple, comprehensible, and immutable. Now, in the wake of the Meiji reforms, that world came crashing down. His daimyo was stripped of authority, and he himself of his stipend. His privilege of wearing two swords, the visible emblem of his status, was snatched away by some bureaucrat in a Western suit. Now, to feed his family, he, a warrior, had to seek employment, to become a petty clerk, a police officer, or, the ultimate humiliation, a rickshaw puller. His neighbor, the son of a merchant who had grown rich supplying the new army, now looked down upon him with disdain. And yesterday's peasant, now conscripted into the imperial army, wore a uniform, carried a rifle, and earned more than a samurai once received in rice. This wasn't merely an economic decline. This was an existential annihilation. Everything he had been taught, everything he had ever believed in, now felt like a cruel deception. And there were hundreds of thousands like him. But the genius of the reformers, who shattered that old world, could never have fully materialized without those we often overlook. A pivotal figure, without whom Japan's industrialization would have been utterly impossible, was a man named Shibusawa Eiichi. He was neither a warrior nor a politician in the conventional sense. He was a financier. Born into a peasant family, he possessed an almost prodigious intuition for economics. It was Shibusawa who grasped that for Japan to compete with the West, it needed more than just an army. It required a modern capitalist system. He founded the nation's first national bank, established its first stock exchange, and built hundreds of companies, ranging from textile mills to breweries. He took the samurai ethic of loyalty and duty and seamlessly transposed it into the world of business, asserting that honest entrepreneurship was, in fact, a new form of national service. While politicians dismantled the old world, Shibusawa was busy constructing a new one from its very ruins. Without his financial genius, the reformers simply would not have possessed the funds for their army, navy, and factories. And here's one striking, everyday detail that truly grounds this whole story. After the nationwide ban on carrying swords, thousands of shops opened, eager to buy up samurai armor and weaponry. But the hottest commodity wasn't the famed katanas, which many samurai carefully hid away as sacred relics. No, the most sought-after items were tsuba, the intricately decorated sword guards. Crafted from metal, often adorned with gold and silver, these tiny masterpieces featured entire mythological scenes carved into their surfaces. These miniature works of art, once integral parts of a warrior's weapon, were now being bought in droves by foreigners as exotic souvenirs. European ladies wore them as fashionable brooches, while gentlemen repurposed them as elegant paperweights. Just imagine that image. The very symbol of a warrior's soul, an object of his pride, painstakingly crafted by masters over months, now resting on the desk of some American merchant, holding down invoices for sewing machine shipments. In this single poignant fact lies the entire tragedy of an era. The grand and sacred had been reduced to a mere trinket. The system built upon the Bushido Code was rigid, yet remarkably stable. It could endure defeat, humiliation, even destitution. But in 1876, the new government did the unthinkable. It struck not at coffers or privileges, but at the very soul of the samurai. The sword abolishment edict, Haitorei, was issued. This dry administrative act became the perfect storm that brought everything crashing down. For hundreds of thousands of samurai, this wasn't just a law. It was an official decree to rip out their very essence and cast it aside. The last thread connecting them to their honor, to their ancestors, to their sense of self, had been severed. The epicenter of this existential earthquake became Satsuma province, the homeland of Saigō Takamori. After his resignation, Saigō didn't simply idly by. He established a vast network of private military academies. On paper, they trained young men for service. In reality, they became a sanctuary for old Japan. Here, kenjutsu was still practiced, swords were still worn, and life was still lived by the tenets of Bushido. From across the country, thousands of ronin, masterless samurai, flocked to Satsuma, embittered, humiliated, but unbroken. Satsuma transformed into an enormous powder keg, saturated with a burning sense of violated honor. Everyone was simply waiting for the spark, and the government in Tokyo itself provided that spark. Frightened by Saigō's growing influence and this dangerous concentration of disgruntled warriors, it took two fatal steps. First, it attempted to secretly remove all gunpowder and ammunition from the arsenal in Kagoshima, Satsuma's capital city. Second, it dispatched spies to Satsuma with a secret order that many interpreted as an assassination plot against Saigō. When the academy students uncovered this conspiracy, their reaction was both predictable and instantaneous. For them, it was the final proof that the central government had betrayed not just them, but the entire nation. Their teacher, their hero, their living ideal was in grave danger. Driven by righteous fury and unwavering loyalty, the young samurai acted without waiting for orders. They stormed the arsenal, seizing weapons and ammunition. With this act, they cornered their idol. Saigō Takamori, a man who valued order and duty above all else, found himself at the helm of a spontaneous rebellion. He could have disavowed his students, branded them criminals, and allowed the government to crush them. But that would have meant betraying those who were boundlessly loyal to him. It would have been a violation of the most fundamental principle of Bushido, the principle of fidelity. And so, he made the only choice a true samurai could make. He led the uprising. And this is where the very dialectic of strength and weakness manifested in all its tragic beauty. The greatest strength of the samurai system, the absolute personal devotion of warriors to their leader, turned against Japan itself. This loyalty, which had bound the country together for centuries, now threatened to tear it apart. Saigō became a prisoner of his followers' love and fealty. His impeccable reputation and charisma, his foremost virtues, transformed into the very locomotive that dragged thousands toward inevitable doom. He couldn't stop them because he was their banner. Moreover, the Bushido Code itself, their fundamental operating system, became their prison. It offered no algorithm for retreat, compromise, or political maneuvering. Faced with the threat of dishonor, the code presented only one solution: battle. No matter the odds, no matter the outcome. Only how one met their fate truly mattered. The Satsuma samurai could not adapt to the new reality because their code of honor was utterly inflexible. It was designed for a world that no longer existed. Their fidelity to ideals became a form of collective suicide. In February of 1877, an army of 30,000 samurai, armed with swords, spears, and antiquated rifles, marched north from Satsuma, aiming for Tokyo. Against them, the government deployed a 70,000-strong imperial army, impeccably trained and equipped with modern rifles and artillery. Saigō, one of the finest military minds of his era, could not have failed to grasp the utter hopelessness of this endeavor. So why did he lead his men on a campaign that, from the very beginning, looked like suicide? Did he genuinely believe in victory? Or was the true purpose of this final desperate march something entirely different? So why did Saigō Takamori lead his men to certain death? For decades, historians offered a simple, almost Marxist answer. It was a rebellion of the impoverished aristocracy, an uprising of hungry and humiliated warriors who simply wanted to reclaim their lands, stipends, and privileges. This version is convenient and logical. It explains motives through easily understood economics, but it fails to account for the irrational, almost mystical tenacity with which the samurai marched toward death, even when defeat became undeniable. Today, thanks to new sources and deeper analysis, another, far more unsettling theory is gaining traction. Saigō and his followers marched on Tokyo not for victory. They marched for an ideal death. They understood that their world was dead, and the only thing left was to transform their demise into the last, greatest lesson of Bushido. This was no civil war. It was a mass ritual suicide stretched out over half a year. But to truly understand why the government acted with such severity and refused to seek compromise, we must temporarily set aside the poetry of Bushido and examine the cold, hard figures in the ledger books. The fact is, the samurai class wasn't merely a warrior caste. It was a colossal black hole in the budget of the nascent empire. Pension and stipend payments to the samurai consumed almost 1/3 of Japan's entire national budget. Just ponder that scale for a moment. With that money, Japan could have built a navy capable of rivaling the British in Asian waters, or laid railroads across the entire country, or opened hundreds of modern factories. The continued existence of the samurai in their old form was an unaffordable luxury for Japan, a direct path to economic collapse and subsequent colonization. This wasn't merely reform, this was a financial amputation, painful, yes, but vitally necessary to save the entire patient, the Japanese nation. And in this context, even military actions acquire a deeper, hidden symbolism. The first move of Saigō's army was the siege of Kumamoto Castle. At first glance, this seemed like a logical military maneuver, seize a key fortress. But in reality, it was much more than that. The Kumamoto garrison was not composed of samurai. It was manned by those very same former peasants, conscripted under universal military service, soldiers of the new imperial army. The siege of Kumamoto Castle wasn't merely a military operation. It was a manifesto, a direct challenge hurled at the entire new world. The samurai, the elite warriors, sought to prove that their spirit, their valor, their martial art was still superior to the faceless masses of commoners armed with rifles. This was an existential debate waged with cannons and katanas, and the samurai lost that argument. A small garrison of peasants, armed with modern tactics and weaponry, withstood a 50-day siege, repelling every ferocious assault launched by the legendary warriors of Satsuma. The debacle at Kumamoto was a devastating blow for the rebels. It starkly revealed that their world had indeed collapsed. Spirit proved impotent against technology, and individual valor succumbed to the anonymous discipline of a mass army. This defeat marked the symbolic end of an entire era. Now, having witnessed the economic noose tightening around the samurais' necks, the relentless logic of their code, and the profound tragedy of individuals caught between epochs, the picture begins to sharpen. We have traced the journey from Commodore Perry's black ships to the Satsuma army's final desperate march. All threads of the narrative, philosophy, economics, technology, and human drama converge at a single point. On the slopes of Mount Shiroyama, where a mere handful of warriors awaits an army outnumbering them by 100 to 1. And the central question remains, why? Why did they not surrender, adapt, or disperse, but instead chose this magnificent, yet utterly meaningless from a military standpoint, finale? What then is the key to this phenomenon? It lies not in economics, nor in politics. The answer is that the Bushido Code, their greatest achievement, was not a flexible set of recommendations. It was a rigid, closed operating system, flawlessly coded for one specific purpose: service in a feudal world. Within this system, there was no command to adapt to fundamental changes. Any attempt to alter its foundational protocols, loyalty, honor, contempt for death, was perceived by the system as a virus, a corruption, a dishonor worse than death itself. For a true samurai, steeped in this system, the choice was not between life and death. The choice was between an honorable death and a life of dishonor. And life in the new world, without a sword, without a lord, in a European suit, where one's status was determined not by valor, but by the amount of money in one's bank account, was precisely that: a life devoid of honor. The system, confronted with an intractable problem, selected the only flawless solution pre-programmed within it: the protocol of a dignified death. And the genius of Saigō Takamori, his ultimate tragedy, lay in the fact that, unlike many of his followers, he understood everything perfectly. He saw the might of the West. He knew Japan needed reforms. Yet, he was the most perfect embodiment of the old system. He could betray neither his code nor the people who believed in him. And so, he made a monumental decision. If the world of Bushido was doomed, then it must perish not quietly and ignominiously, but in a blinding blaze of glory. The Satsuma Rebellion was not an attempt to win. It was the final and most magnificent production, choreographed by Saigō Takamori. It was a demonstration aimed at all of Japan and at all of its future. He was showing them, this is the true spirit of Yamato, this is true loyalty, this is how a samurai ought to die. He deliberately transformed a military campaign into a living illustration of the code, where every battle, every defeat, only highlighted their spiritual supremacy with greater brilliance. Their goal was Shi-ni-bana, the flower of death. In Japanese culture, there's a concept that some things achieve true beauty only at the moment of their demise, like a cherry blossom that falls at the peak of its bloom. The Satsuma samurai were not simply marching to their deaths. They were marching to flower in death. They were transforming their end into a work of art, into the final, irrefutable proof of the truth of their chosen path. They lost the war for Japan's future, but they won the war for their own myth. They lost the battle against the emperor's soldiers, but they triumphed over oblivion. And when we grasp this, the scale of events shifts. It is no longer merely a tragic tale of a rebellion quashed. This is a story of a civilization that consciously chose the preservation of its ideals over physical survival. It is a design of titanic, almost mythological scope. This transcends mere politics or warfare. This is aesthetics pushed to its bloody, absolute limit. The death of Saigō Takamori and his last samurai on Mount Shiroyama was not the end of a story. On the contrary, it became its new beginning. This final bloody act removed the last obstacle to Japan's complete modernization. With the suppression of the Satsuma rebellion, the reformist government found its hands entirely untied. A domino effect was unleashed with incredible speed. In the next 20 years, the country would be crisscrossed by a network of railways. Its factories would begin producing steel and ships, and its new army and navy, built on Western models, would first crush China and then, to the astonishment of the entire world, humiliate the Russian Empire. The paradox is that the self-destruction of the samurai class, the guardian of tradition, allowed Japan to achieve the most rapid leap into modernity in human history. The old world had to die for the new one to be born. But here is where it gets really interesting. The government that destroyed the samurai as a class immediately began to resurrect them as a myth. The reformers, themselves former samurai, realized they desperately needed the very spirit they had just eradicated. Building an industrial empire required not only technology, but also millions of people willing to selflessly toil and die for the nation. And so, they took the Bushido Code, scrubbed from it everything related to personal loyalty to a feudal lord, and inserted in its place a new, absolute object of worship, the emperor and the state. Saigō Takamori, yesterday's rebel, was posthumously pardoned, rehabilitated, and a monument was erected to him, the new regime's chief enemy, in the very heart of Tokyo. He became a national hero, the quintessential embodiment of the Japanese spirit. The system absorbed its enemy and transformed him into its icon. And this legacy is all around us today, even if we don't recognize its origins. When we speak of the Japanese economic miracle, we are seeing precisely this: a mutated Bushido. Lifetime employment in corporations, where an employee demonstrates absolute loyalty to the company, just as a samurai would to his clan. The concept of Kaizen, continuous self-improvement, is a direct echo of endless sword training, transferred to the assembly line. The figure of the corporate warrior in a sharp suit, ready to work 18 hours a day and sacrifice family for the firm's success, is a direct descendant of the samurai for whom duty was paramount. The katana was replaced by a briefcase, armor by an Armani suit, but the fundamental operating system remained the same: service, self-sacrifice, group loyalty. Global culture, too, has been captivated by this myth. The West, weary of its own pragmatism, fell in love with the image of the last noble warrior marching with a sword against cannons. Dozens of films, from Kurosawa to The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, romanticized this story, transforming it into a universal myth about the struggle between spirit and technology, tradition and progress. Anime, manga, and video games have made the samurai one of the most recognizable cultural archetypes on the planet. But this is merely a glossy, safe version of the code, from which its darkest and most demanding essence has been removed. And here we arrive at the main and most frightening paradox of this legacy. The original idea of Bushido was deeply personal. It was a code of individual honor. A samurai died for his specific lord, whom he knew face to face, or for his clan. But in the 20th century, this idea was distorted beyond recognition. It was transformed into a tool of state militarist ideology. Personal loyalty to a lord morphed into impersonal devotion to the nation. And the right to ritual suicide to preserve honor mutated into an obligation to commit mass suicide in the name of victory. It was precisely this perverted, state-sanctioned version of Bushido that spawned the kamikaze pilots and banzai charges of World War II. Thousands of young people, raised on the myth of self-sacrifice, unhesitatingly gave their lives in hopeless attacks, believing it to be the highest expression of the Yamato spirit. The beautiful and tragic flower of death, which Saigō and his men cultivated on Mount Shiroyama as an act of personal choice, transformed into an assembly line for living torpedoes. The great code of personal honor became the justification for the most impersonal and industrialized form of death. This was its final, most monstrous transformation. The story of the samurai seems to us an exotic fairy tale from a distant past. Swords, kimonos, ritual suicides. What does all of this have in common with our world of neural networks, global markets, and information warfare? But take a moment to look closely, and we will see, as in a mirror, a reflection of our own most pressing challenges. The test that history posed to the samurai in the 19th century is the very same test that confronts us today. It is the challenge of fundamental and rapid change. Their world collapsed under the onslaught of industrialization and globalization. Our world is fraying at the seams under the pressure of the digital revolution, climate change, and the restructuring of the entire global order. Like the samurai, we cling to our familiar professions, social statuses, and ideologies, which are visibly losing their relevance. Like them, we feel confusion and fear in the face of a future that is arriving faster than we can comprehend it. Their tragedy is a warning for any system, be it a corporation, a state, or an entire civilization, that has believed too strongly in its own infallibility. And what is the main, non-trivial lesson we can glean from this drama? It is not the banal "you need to be flexible and adapt." That is too simplistic. The lesson is far deeper and more unsettling. The greatest strength of any system, ideology, or code is simultaneously its Achilles heel. What makes you powerful in one context is guaranteed to kill you in another. For the samurai, this strength was absolute loyalty and a willingness to die for an ideal. This very quality made them the elite for centuries. But when the context changed, this same strength transformed into a program of self-destruction. They could not betray their ideal, even when it became meaningless. They proved too perfect, too loyal to their code. This lesson is ruthlessly relevant for us. Today, we build complex systems, financial, technological, political, and pride ourselves on their efficiency and logic. We create corporate cultures founded on total loyalty. We develop artificial intelligence that operates on strict, unshakable algorithms. And the story of the samurai poses a very uncomfortable question. What if tomorrow the context changes as radically as it did for them? What if our devotion to efficiency becomes our downfall? What if our faith in progress proves to be a trap? The tragedy of the samurai teaches us that the most difficult task is not to follow the rules, but to recognize in time that the rules are obsolete and to find the courage to rewrite them. This demands not just flexibility, but the capacity for self-betrayal, the ability to abandon the very idea that made you great yesterday. This is an almost impossible task for an individual, and even more so for an entire society. And perhaps the most crucial preliminary conclusion is this. History is not an archive of dead facts. It is a laboratory where experiments on human nature have been conducted for millennia, and the story of the samurai is one of the purest and most brutal of these experiments. It shows that ideals can be more dangerous than any weapon, and that absolute loyalty to them is not a virtue, but the most elegant form of suicide. Now, let's flip the script. Let's step onto the other side and view this narrative through the eyes of the so-called traitors, the Meiji restoration reformers, figures like Ōkubo Toshimichi. We've grown accustomed to seeing them as cold, soulless pragmatists who dismantled a beautiful old world. But that's a caricature, a gross oversimplification. To grasp their logic, we must first grasp their terror. These were not Europeans. They were samurai to their very bones, steeped in the same ancient code. But unlike Saigō, their gaze was not turned inward toward Japan, but outward, and what they beheld there filled them with utter dread. They witnessed a colossal, ancient and proud China brought to its knees and trampled by a mere handful of British opium merchants. They saw India transformed into a sprawling colony. They watched as the entire world was carved up by European powers whose sole guiding principle was the cold logic of gunboats and factories. For them, the choice was brutally simple, starkly clear. Japan would either transform right then and there, or in 2 decades, it would become yet another European colony. Their actions weren't a betrayal of samurai ideals. They were a desperate, almost panicked attempt to rescue Japan itself from China's tragic fate. They were not destroyers. They were surgeons who dared to amputate a gangrenous limb to save the entire organism, and that limb was their own social class. So, how did Saigō and his followers appear in their eyes? Imagine yourself in Ōkubo's shoes, in Tokyo. You're striving to forge a vital trade agreement with Germany, securing loans from Britain to erect the nation's first steel mill, laying down a telegraph line that will connect you to the entire world. Meanwhile, dispatches arrive from the nation's south, reporting that thousands of the nation's finest warriors have risen in rebellion because they were forbidden from carrying a piece of metal at their hip. From your vantage point, a global perspective, this isn't a tragedy. It's an absurd, infantile uprising. To the Meiji government's pragmatists, the Satsuma samurai weren't noble warriors, but dangerous Luddites, attempting to smash the ship's rudder in the midst of a storm simply because they disliked the sound of the steam engine. The cultural clash was mutual. To the samurai, the government spoke a language of dishonor and mere coin. To the government, the samurai spoke a language as utterly useless in the New World as Latin would be on a bustling stock exchange. Their obsession with ritual purity, their cult of death, their inability to conceive of a national budget, all of it seemed to them a perilous form of collective madness. And herein lies the tragedy of predictability. The reformers triumphed not merely because they possessed more rifles. They won because they understood their enemy's source code. They themselves were programmed by that very code, yet they managed to transcend its limitations. They knew that when confronted with humiliation, the Bushido system could yield only one response, a symmetrical and furious counterblow. They understood that honor would forbid the samurai from waging guerrilla warfare, from retreating, or from compromising. They would seek a decisive battle, eager to die a beautiful death. They knew Saigō Takamori, as the system's perfect embodiment, would be its most predictable component. He could not abandon his disciples, could not defy their will, could not refuse a challenge. His greatest virtues, loyalty and integrity, became, for the Meiji government, the most reliable levers of control. Essentially, they played upon his nobility like a musical instrument, knowing precisely what melody he would perform. The samurai's strength, their unyielding code, ultimately became their fatal flaw. Their actions were utterly transparent to those who had cracked that code. They marched into battle against an army whose commanders knew every single one of their next moves in advance. This was not a war between two armies. It was a war between two eras, two operating systems. And the victor was the one capable of processing more variables and thinking several moves ahead. The most terrifying moral compromise for the architects of the new Japan was the decision to annihilate not merely an enemy, but a brother, a mentor, their own past, embodied by Saigō Takamori. And the man forced to make this fateful choice was his closest friend and comrade, Ōkubo Toshimichi. This decision was more than a political act. It was an act of personal, almost Shakespearean betrayal in the name of a greater purpose, and it left an unhealing wound on Ōkubo's soul forever. He believed he was saving Japan, but he knew with absolute certainty that in doing so, he was killing its very spirit. To comprehend the true cost of this success, we must delve into Ōkubo's inner world. Contemporaries described him as a man with an icy heart. He almost never smiled, spoke in an even, quiet voice, and made the most ruthless decisions with the detached air of an engineer studying a blueprint. He was the complete antithesis of the charismatic and fiery Saigō. Yet, this coldness wasn't an innate quality. It was an armor he donned to bear the inhuman weight of responsibility. Ōkubo, an idealist in his youth, had transformed into an absolute pragmatist. He viewed history not as a series of heroic deeds, but as a relentless mechanism where, to build something new, the old must always be torn down. and he voluntarily embraced the role of executioner for the old world. He watched as his reforms stripped thousands of people of their life's meaning, as centuries-old foundations crumbled, as his comrades from yesteryear cursed his name. The solitude at the pinnacle of power was absolute. He couldn't share his doubts with anyone, because any sign of weakness would have been perceived as an invitation to rebellion. He became the living embodiment of the state, impersonal, efficient, and ruthless. He sacrificed his popularity, his peace of mind, and ultimately his very humanity for the future of his country. And this transformation was his personal, hidden tragedy. And the greatest casualty on this altar of progress was, of course, Saigō Takamori. Their story isn't merely a clash between two politicians. It's a drama of two dearest friends whom history had cast on opposite sides of the barricades. They grew up on the same streets in Kagoshima. They read the same books together. They dreamed of Japan's revival together. They fought shoulder to shoulder against the shogunate, risking their lives. Saigō was the heart and soul of their alliance, while Ōkubo was its brain and will. And now, Ōkubo, the head of the government, had to issue the order for the annihilation of the army led by his best friend. He understood that Saigō wasn't the enemy. He was a symptom of the disease from which the country needed healing. But to cure the disease, its most noble symptom had to be eradicated. Every report from the battlefield, where the imperial army was pushing back the rebels, was for Ōkubo not a bulletin of victory, but an obituary for his own youth, his ideals, his friendship. He methodically and coldly killed his past. The conclusion of this story was inevitable. Ōkubo prevailed. He laid the foundation for modern Japan. But just 1 year after Saigō's death, his carriage in Tokyo was surrounded by a group of Satsuma samurai. They cut him down with their swords, shouting the name of their fallen hero. The ghost of the old world, which Ōkubo had tried to bury, returned to claim him. The price of genius proved to be profoundly concrete. For the right to build the future, Ōkubo paid not only with the soul of his friend, but with his own life. When two civilizations collide, it rarely resembles a friendly merger. In Japan, during the Meiji era, it was more akin to a head-on collision of two trains hurtling at full speed. It wasn't a synthesis, but a brutal cultural oxymoron played out on the city streets. In Tokyo, one could witness a stark Victorian-style brick building, ugly in Japanese eyes and lit by gas lamps, rising alongside an elegant wooden temple built according to the tenets of Zen simplicity. This wasn't architectural eclecticism, it was a war of worldviews etched in stone and wood. This conflict permeated everything. How could the Shinto myth of the emperor's divine origin be reconciled with Darwin's theory of evolution, now taught in new universities? How could the concept of personal freedom, GU, be explained in a language where the word historically carried connotations of licentiousness and selfishness? An entire generation found itself in a state of profound cognitive dissonance. They were taught to bow towards the imperial palace, then in physics classes, enlightened about Newton's laws, which left no room for divine intervention. The old world of meanings was unraveling at the seams, while the new one offered only a cold, rational void. But human culture, much like nature, abhors a vacuum. And from this chaos, the most bizarre hybrids began to emerge. The motto of the era became the phrase, Wakon Yosai, Japanese spirit, Western technology. And this motto was literally embodied in daily life. On the streets, one might encounter an official in a traditional silk kimono and getter sandals, yet carrying a European umbrella and a pocket watch on a chain. Or a samurai who had shaved off his ancestral topknot, the chômage, but wore a traditional Haitorei jacket over a Western suit. This wasn't merely fashion. It was a desperate attempt to assemble a new identity from the wreckage of two worlds, to harness the West's strength while preserving an intrinsically Japanese soul. These hybrids sprouted everywhere. Artists who had for centuries painted flat, exquisite ukiyo-e woodblock prints suddenly discovered the laws of European perspective and began depicting steam locomotives and telegraph poles in their works. Chefs, forbidden for centuries from preparing meat, took the Austrian schnitzel as their inspiration, but breaded it in airy Japanese panko crumbs, served it with rice and miso soup, and called it tonkatsu. Thus was born an entire cuisine, yoshoku, Western food adapted for the Japanese palate. This was not imitation, but creative reinterpretation, the birth of something entirely new at the crossroads of civilizations. But how did this clash transform the life of the common person who neither read Darwin nor tasted schnitzel? The most fundamental change arrived with the concept of time. For centuries, Japanese people lived by the lunar calendar and the rhythms of nature. Now, the government introduced the Gregorian calendar and the 24-hour workday. Time ceased to flow like a river and began to tick like a bomb. Life became governed not by the sunrise, but by the factory whistle and the train schedule. This was a revolution of consciousness, far more profound than any political reforms. The very foundations of daily life shifted. For centuries, Buddhism had imposed a prohibition on meat consumption, but the Meiji government actively began promoting meat eating, asserting that it was precisely what made Westerners so tall and strong. The emperor himself publicly consumed a piece of beef, setting an example for the entire nation. For many elders, this was sacrilege, a betrayal of their ancestors' faith. For the youth, it symbolized progress and an embrace of the barbarian's strength. Food ceased to be merely sustenance. It became a political statement. The entire country lived in a state of cultural schizophrenia. In the morning, you might participate in a tea ceremony, contemplating harmony and emptiness, and by afternoon, attend a public lecture on the advantages of a parliamentary monarchy. Meiji Japan was not a melting pot. It was more like an alchemical crucible into which incompatible elements were cast and heated to their limit. The result was not an alloy, but an entirely new, brilliant, yet incredibly fragile and unstable substance, the modern Japanese nation. The clash between the Meiji government and the Satsuma samurai wasn't confined to the battlefields alone. This was one of history's inaugural total information wars, where the primary weapons weren't rifles, but potent myths. And the reformers' genius lay in their orchestration of the greatest rebranding in Japan's history. They seized upon the nation's most ancient and sacred symbol, the emperor, who for centuries had been little more than a ceremonial figurehead devoid of true power, and transformed him into the sacred focal point of the nascent nation. This was a masterful move. Every decree, every reform, even the most unpopular ones, were now promulgated not in the name of a cabal of former samurai in Tokyo, but in the name of a living god. The propaganda machine churned relentlessly. The nascent education system hammered into young minds the sacred duty owed to the emperor. Newspapers, just then finding their footing, emblazoned their pages with portraits of the monarch in a European military uniform, a potent symbol of the seamless fusion of tradition and progress. Shinto, the ancient indigenous religion, was effectively transmuted into a state cult, with the emperor elevated to its high priest. To resist these reforms now wasn't merely a matter of political dissent. It meant defying the will of a deity, branding oneself an enemy of the entire nation. The Meiji government had forged an impenetrable ideological armor, but the samurai countered with their own, equally cunning, propaganda jujitsu. They couldn't directly attack the emperor. That would have been sacrilege. So they wove a myth of a captive deity. In their narrative, the emperor remained pure and sacred, but he was surrounded by a cabal of malevolent, corrupt, westernized advisors who, through deceit, compelled him to sign decrees ruinous to the nation. This narrative was ingenious in its simplicity and effectiveness. It allowed the samurai to maintain a veneer of loyalty to the throne, even as they waged war against the government. Their rallying cry wasn't "overthrow the emperor," but rather to Tokyo to free the emperor from his nefarious advisors. Saigō Takamori, in this counter-propaganda, wasn't portrayed as a rebel, but as the throne's most loyal paladin, riding to rescue his sovereign. They spread rumors that the reformers had sold the country to foreigners for whiskey and cigars, that they scorned Japanese customs and secretly scoffed at samurai honor. And this myth of the tragic, deceived, yet utterly loyal Saigō proved incredibly resilient. It became so deeply ingrained in the popular consciousness that just a few years later, the very government that defeated Saigō was able to rehabilitate him and elevate him to a national hero. The rebels' propaganda, it turned out, trumped the official narrative. And here we arrive at a classic case where history is written by the victors. Consider the final battle on Mount Shiroyama. In the official reports of the Meiji government and early history textbooks, this event was described as the suppression of the Kagoshima Rebellion, a dry, almost clinical formulation. The emphasis was placed on it being the final, desperate sortie of a group of armed insurgents, swiftly and professionally neutralized by troops loyal to the emperor. It was a story of order restored and the ultimate triumph of progress over reactionary feudalism. But if we view this event through the lens of Lieutenant Yamada's diary or the testimonies of surviving samurai, the picture shifts dramatically. This wasn't a mere sortie. It was a final, desperate charge, launched after Saigō had disbanded the bulk of his army, leaving him with only a handful of his most devoted followers. They had virtually no ammunition, no food, and no hope whatsoever, not even for survival, let alone victory. From a military standpoint, their actions were pure madness. But from the perspective of Bushido, it was the culmination, the perfect finale. They weren't advancing in attack, they were marching toward their own execution, but on their own terms, swords in hand. The official history, penned by the victors, concealed the ritualistic, philosophical core of the event behind a curtain of military police reports. It told what happened, but deliberately omitted why it truly happened. The original vision of the Meiji Restoration was crystal clear. Sono joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. It was a passionate, almost xenophobic surge to restore Japan's purity, its divine uniqueness, its samurai spirit. Thousands of warriors died for this very idea. And then, once victory was achieved and the shogunate overthrown, the greatest betrayal in the nation's history unfolded. The victors, Japan's new leaders, staring reality in the face, made a fateful decision. They realized that expelling the barbarians was impossible. The only way to survive was to become them. And in that moment, the end stopped justifying the means. The means, industrialization, westernization, pragmatism, became ends in themselves. The grand idea of purification transformed into its complete antithesis, a project of total replication. This 180-degree turn inevitably led to a profound internal schism. The epicenter of this rift was the famous dispute of 1873 over the invasion of Korea. For Saigō Takamori and the Old Guard, this was an obvious next step. Korea had shown disrespect to the new imperial regime, and a military expedition offered a perfect way to both punish a brazen neighbor and, far more importantly, give work and purpose to hundreds of thousands of humiliated and idle samurai. This would have been a war in the old, familiar style, a war for honor. But the pragmatists, led by Ōkubo Toshimichi, who had just returned from an extensive tour of America and Europe, stood united against this idea. They had seen the factories of Pittsburgh and the shipyards of Liverpool. They had witnessed armies armed with breech-loading rifles and Krupp artillery. And they realized with chilling horror just how fragile, backward and defenseless their own nation was. For them, starting a war now, even a small one, meant national suicide. This wasn't merely a debate about foreign policy. It was a clash of two universes. Saigō's universe, where the world was governed by spirit and honor, and Ōkubo's universe, where the world was ruled by steel, coal, and capital. When the pragmatists blocked the decision to invade, Saigō perceived it not as a political defeat, but as a personal insult and a betrayal of everything they had fought for. He, the greatest hero of the Restoration, found himself in the minority within the very government he had helped create. His resignation from all posts and departure from Tokyo to his native Satsuma became a watershed moment. It was the point where two former comrades, two friends, finally diverged. Ōkubo chose the new pragmatic reality. Saigō remained loyal to the old, dying ideal. The revolution, as often happens, had begun to devour its own fathers. And the most powerful symbolic act that marked this turning point was the creation of a universal conscript army. This law, enacted in that same year of 1873, was more than just a military reform. It was a death sentence for the samurai class. For 700 years, the samurai had held a monopoly on violence, serving as the sole defenders of the nation. This was their sacred right and duty. And now, the state officially declared, "You are no longer needed." "We can take any peasant or fisherman," the implicit message went, "give him a rifle, train him for 3 months, and he will perform your function just as well, and, crucially, far more cheaply." This was the most devastating blow. It transformed a caste of warrior demigods into an anachronism, a useless and costly cancerous growth on the nation's body. The state they had helped forge now viewed them as a problem to be solved. After this, the point of no return was definitively crossed. The path to dialogue was closed. Only the path to Shiroyama remained. Who truly won and who lost in this new Japan, forged from the ashes of civil war? At the apex of the new social pyramid sat a curious chimera. On one side, the old aristocracy, the former feudal lords, or daimyo, and court nobles, stripped of real power but showered with titles and pensions, locked away in gilded cages. On the other, and this was the true power, a new oligarchy comprised of pragmatic reformers who seized all key government posts and their allies. Yesterday's merchants and moneylenders who founded the first industrial giants, the Zaibatsu. And at the very bottom, they found themselves, the samurai. They didn't merely lose, they were erased as a class. Their world, their code, their very reason for being, all of it transformed into a museum exhibit. The economy of New Japan was literally built upon the bones of the samurai class. Vast sums, which for centuries had been allocated to paying rice stipends to millions of warriors, were now liberated and funneled into a singular crucible of national construction. These were the very funds that built the first arsenal in Tokyo, purchased textile machinery from Britain, and laid the telegraph line connecting Tokyo and Osaka. Every new factory, every new warship, every kilometer of railroad track was paid for from the pockets of the disbanded warrior class. This fundamentally reshaped the nation's map. Centers of power shifted from the old castle towns, which had served for centuries as capitals of samurai clans, to new industrial ports like Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagasaki. The air in these cities now reeked not of cherry blossoms, but of coal and machine oil. The ancient roads, along which daimyo once conducted their opulent processions to the capital, became overgrown with grass. New steel arteries bound the country into a single economic space, governed by the logic not of honor, but of profit. The psychology of the survivors was cleaved in two. On one hand, a wave of euphoria swept the nation. It was an intoxicating sensation of national rebirth, a race to catch up with and surpass the West. The younger generation enthusiastically studied English, devoured European philosophers, adopted Western hairstyles, and saw in the smoking factory chimneys not an eyesore, but a symbol of future might. The country lived in a state of perpetual building frenzy, where every new steamboat launched was hailed as a national triumph. But beneath this glittering surface lurked a deep collective trauma. Millions of people, raised in the old world, felt like strangers at this feast of progress. They experienced a phantom limb pain for the bygone era, for its clarity, nobility, and order. And this yearning, this feeling of irreparable loss, found its perfect symbol, Saigō Takamori. In popular memory, he was transformed from a rebel into a sainted martyr, the last bearer of the true Japanese spirit, fallen in a struggle against soulless and venal modernity. Ultimately, the entire nation's worldview was turned upside down. Buddhist serenity and samurai disdain for worldly concerns gave way to a new religion, the religion of national success. The era's guiding motto became Fukoku Kyohei, rich country, strong army. Life ceased to be a path to personal enlightenment or an impeccable death. It became an endless race, a competition with other nations where the chief measure of success was the quantity of steel smelted and the displacement of battleships constructed. Japan survived. But for that survival, it paid with its former soul. Behind the ruthless pragmatism of the Meiji reforms lay not merely a thirst for power or fear. What underpinned it was a powerful, chilling, and surprisingly coherent philosophical concept. It can be encapsulated in 4 words: Wakon Yosai, Japanese spirit, Western technology. This wasn't just a convenient formula. It was a desperate attempt to perform vivisection on their own civilization, to meticulously open its body, extract its outdated feudal organs, and replace them with modern Western implants, a constitution, banks, factories, all while somehow preserving its unique, elusive soul untouched. The entire tragedy and triumph of the Meiji era are distilled in this internal contradiction. To save its essence, Japan had to change its form beyond recognition. And this idea had its chief ideologue, its intellectual engine. His name was Fukuzawa Yukichi. He was neither a politician nor a general. He was a thinker, translator, and educator, and his influence on the minds of an entire generation was colossal. His book, An Encouragement of Learning, began with a phrase that, for hierarchical Japan, sounded like an explosion. Heaven does not create one man above another, nor one man below another. Fukuzawa argued that the West's strength wasn't in its cannons or its ships. Their true power lay in scientific, rational thought, in the spirit of independence, and in practical knowledge. He asserted that Japan needed not more warriors, but more engineers, doctors, and economists. He was the grey eminence of this revolution, fighting not with a sword, but with a printing press, and his ideas provided the reformers with the philosophical bedrock that justified their most radical actions. Opposing this new philosophy of pragmatism and progress stood another doctrine, equally coherent and deeply rooted. This wasn't just the martial code of Bushido, it was an entire universe of Neo-Confucian ethics, perceiving the world as an unshakable, ideal hierarchy. In this worldview, every person had their predestined place. The farmer was meant to cultivate rice, the merchant to trade, and the samurai to serve and to die. The meaning of life wasn't to change the world or oneself, but to flawlessly perform one's part in this cosmic drama. This philosophy valued not progress, but stability, not personal achievement, but the fulfillment of duty, not critical thinking, but absolute loyalty. Saigō Takamori wasn't merely a general of this old guard, he was its high priest, the living embodiment of this dying faith. This clash of ideas constantly spilled over into the realm of realpolitik. When the government abolished samurai privileges, from Fukuzawa's philosophical perspective, it was a logical and necessary step to unleash the nation's energy. From Saigō's Confucian ethical viewpoint, this was an act of sacrilege, a destruction of divine order that would inevitably plunge the country into chaos. When Ōkubo spoke of the necessity of building factories, he thought in terms of national GDP and global competitiveness. When Saigō spoke of the necessity of an expedition to Korea, he thought in terms of insulted honor and the national spirit. They spoke entirely different philosophical languages, and thus were doomed to misunderstanding each other. Yet, There was a third, shadowy philosophical doctrine that the reformers didn't openly publicize, but which nonetheless guided their actions. This was social Darwinism, imported from the West. The notion that nations, much like biological species, engaged in a ruthless struggle for survival where only the fittest prevailed, found perfectly fertile ground in Japan. It offered a simple, scientific explanation for everything unfolding around them. Why must we dismantle the samurai class? Because it is inefficient and hinders the nation's survival in the competitive struggle. Why must we emulate the West? Because they are the strongest, and we must adopt their traits lest we be consumed. This ruthless philosophy absolved them of any moral reflection and transformed politics into a form of natural selection. Ultimately, it was this hybrid, Fukuzawa's pragmatism, amplified by social Darwinism, that triumphed. It proved more effective for the nation's survival in the 19th century. But this victory charted Japan's course for decades to come. The cult of national success, the idea of an unending struggle for a place in the sun, and the readiness to sacrifice everything for collective survival, all of these, born in the Meiji era as a defensive mechanism, evolved in the 20th century into an ideology of expansion. The philosophical foundation upon which the new Japan was built proved incredibly solid, yet from its very inception, a hairline crack was embedded within it, one that would eventually bring the entire edifice crashing down. And so, it seemed, triumph was achieved. The rebellion crushed, the last samurai dead, the system forged by the Meiji oligarchs stood at the apex of its power, monolithic, omnipotent, invincible. Yet, precisely at this moment of absolute victory, the inevitable process of entropy began. The grand system, born for struggle and conquest, suddenly found all its adversaries vanquished. And then, stripped of the external pressures that had bound it together, it began to devour itself from within. There was no new enemy. The victors themselves became their own greatest foe. The catalyst for this unraveling was the death of its chief architect. In 1878, just months after Saigō's demise, the icily pragmatic Ōkubo Toshimichi was assassinated. His murder wasn't merely an act of revenge, it was the removal of the very keystone, that relentless will that had held the entire structure in balance. While Ōkubo was alive, he was the undisputed first among equals, his authority checking the ambitions of the others. With his death, the system lost its center of gravity. The unity, forged in the fires of revolution, fractured. Immediately, a merciless struggle for his legacy ensued. Ōkubo's heirs, his former comrades, began to tear the grand vision into pieces, each interpreting it to their own advantage. This wasn't an open war, but a quiet, behind-the-scenes clash of titans. On one side stood Ito Hirobumi, a brilliant politician and diplomat who envisioned Japan's future as a centralized bureaucratic empire with a Prussian-style constitution controlled by an elite. On the other, Yamagata Aritomo, the father of the new army, a grim militarist who believed the military should stand above the government and serve as the ultimate guarantor of stability. Both desired greatness for Japan, but their visions of that greatness were incompatible. Ito built a civil society, Yamagata, a military caste. Ito created ministries, Yamagata, a general staff. They siphoned power, establishing parallel centers of influence that regarded each other with suspicion and animosity. The original blueprint for a unified, strong nation began to delaminate, transforming into a battlefield between civil and military elites. This crack, laid in the initial years after victory, would widen into an abyss a half-century later, eventually engulfing the entire country. But while the oligarchs grappled for power, the last shard of the original, pure idea of the Meiji Restoration stepped onto the stage. This was the freedom and people's rights movement. It was spearheaded by former samurai and intellectuals who had taken the slogans of the Enlightenment seriously. They naively believed that since the country had embarked on a path of progress, it should go all the way, create a genuine parliament, adopt a democratic constitution, and grant people real rights. They were the last idealists, the final bearers of that faith in renewal with which everything had begun. For the ruling clique, this movement was more terrifying than any samurai rebellion. The samurai were enemies from the past, understandable and predictable. But these liberals were enemies from the future. They threatened not just the oligarchs' power, but the very model of controlled authoritarian progress they were building. The reaction was swift and brutal. The full might of the state machine was unleashed upon the movement. Censorship, arrests, the dissolution of organizations. The tragedy was that the freedom movement wasn't annihilated. It was co-opted and neutered. The oligarchs, seizing the very idea of a constitution from them, penned their own, one that vested absolute power in the emperor and, in reality, in themselves, leaving the populace with only the illusion of political participation. The last bastion of idealism was extinguished. To survive, the great system devoured its own children, the most loyal adherents to its initial slogans. This was its ultimate moral collapse, and simultaneously its greatest political triumph, marking the end of an era of revolutionary hopes. After the Second World War, the word Bushido became almost a slur in Japan. The Great Code wasn't merely forgotten, it was cursed. Its name became synonymous with mindless fanaticism, war crimes, and the national catastrophe into which militarists had plunged the country. The state, which for decades had engaged in philosophical taxidermy, creating a stuffed effigy for ideological propaganda out of a living code of honor, achieved its goal. The original was completely erased from memory, and its grotesque copy led the nation to utter ruin. Long decades of oblivion followed as the Japanese, ashamed of their recent past, attempted to construct a new identity in which there was no place for swords or samurai valor. And so, in this vacuum, this scorched earth of national spirit, the moment of rediscovery occurred. And, as often happens in history, the key to understanding oneself had to be found through the eyes of another. That key was a small book written at the turn of the century. Its author, Nitobe Inatsu, was a Japanese intellectual educated in the United States, and his book, Bushido, The Soul of Japan, he wrote not for Japanese readers, but for Americans in English, attempting to explain the enigmatic Japanese soul to the Western world. It was a romanticized, idealized version of the code, cleansed of blood and brutality, presented in terms understandable to a Christian, emphasizing honor, bravery, and self-control. And then, this very text, this exported version of Bushido, was translated back into Japanese after the war and exploded like a bombshell. For a nation grappling with a profound identity crisis, this book became a life raft. It offered them a version of their own past that they could be proud of, a version untainted by militarism. It essentially declared, look, at the core of your culture lies not fanaticism, but a noble code of honor that fascinates the entire world. An incredible thing happened. Japan rediscovered its own soul by reading about it in a book written for foreigners. But this new reading was deeply selective. Post-war Japan extracted from this idealized Bushido only what it needed for its new surge forward. It discarded the cult of death and war, but embraced the principles of absolute loyalty, iron discipline, and the pursuit of perfection in one's craft. And these principles were transferred from the battlefield to the assembly line. Thus was born the phenomenon of the corporate warrior, ready to sacrifice everything for the prosperity of their company, just as a samurai sacrificed their life for their clan. Bushido was resurrected, but no longer as a code of death, but as a code of labor. This was its second, and this time, economic birth. The Western world, in turn, produced its own misreading. Through Akira Kurosawa's films, which captivated Western audiences in the 1950s, the world fell in love not with the complex philosophy of Bushido, but with its mesmerizing aesthetics, silent warriors whose swords moved at the speed of thought, tragic duels in the rain, and the very idea of service taken to its absolute extreme. The apotheosis of this process was George Lucas, who took the helmet of samurai armor, dressed Darth Vader in it, and transformed the samurai themselves into Jedi Knights with lightsabers. So the Great Code completed a full cycle of transformation. From the personal philosophy of a warrior, it became a state ideology. Then, after oblivion, it was reborn as the ethic of corporate capitalism in Japan and as a universal pop culture myth in the West. Each era read it in its own way, imbuing it with the meanings it needed. And beneath these numerous layers of interpretation lay buried that very initial, terrifyingly beautiful code of Saigō Takamori, for whom the sole purpose and justification of existence was a flawless, conscious, and voluntary death. And so, the circle closed. We began with a paradox. How did a code that forged invincible warriors become a program for their self-destruction? Having journeyed through this entire history, we see that it was no accident. It was embedded in the very DNA of the system. The Bushido Code was too perfect, too pure, too uncompromising for an imperfect, messy, and compromise-filled world. It was like a perfectly cut diamond, beautiful but unable to change its form, and so, when confronted with an irresistible force, it does not bend. It shatters into a myriad of sparkling fragments. And herein lies the central, unresolvable paradox of this entire saga. The relentless pursuit of absolute order and pristine purity inevitably unleashes the most brutal chaos when it clashes with the imperfections of real life. The samurai crafted the most meticulously ordered system of honor, and yet it was this very system that compelled them to commit the most irrational and chaotic act imaginable: mass suicide in the name of an ideal that had long ceased to exist. Their greatest virtue, loyalty, became their fatal flaw. Their story isn't just a dusty chapter in a history book, it's a flawless mirror reflecting our own age. Because we, living in the 21st century, haven't truly shed our codes. We've merely rebranded them, given them slick new labels. Our own codes? They're etched in our unwavering faith in boundless technological progress, our zealous cult of economic efficiency, and our rock-solid conviction that any problem, no matter how complex, can be cracked by the perfect algorithm. And these very systems also bestow upon us immense power. They enable us to weave intricate global networks, orchestrate vast markets, and even delve into the deepest mysteries of the genome. We gaze back at the samurai, a comfortable distance afforded by our own era, and shake our heads with a touch of pity. How could they have been so blind to the obvious, we wonder? How could anyone charge a machine gun with nothing but a sword, all for the sake of some abstract notion of honor? We convince ourselves that we, by contrast, are undeniably smarter, more adaptable, and far more pragmatic. Yet, as we observe this completed drama unfold, a critical question surfaces. Are we, armed with all our dazzling technologies and vast reservoirs of knowledge, truly something fundamentally different? Or is every one of our seemingly unshakable codes, be it our creed of perpetual growth, our devotion to digital efficiency, or our blind faith in market infallibility, simply a modern incarnation of Bushido, leading us just as inexorably toward our own, distinct yet equally inescapable Mount Shiroyama? In other words, can we ever truly recognize the moment our greatest strength morphs into our deadliest vulnerability? Or are we destined, time and again, to reenact this very tragedy, merely swapping out the stage props and weapons?